From the marriage bed to the battlefield, from the legal assembly to the funeral pyre, sexuality in Norse culture was never private, never innocent, and never separated from the brutal mechanics of power. Let us begin with a fundamental truth that governed Viking society. Masculinity was not merely about physical strength or warrior prowess. It was explicitly defined by sexual dominance. The Norse legal codes reveal an obsession with active versus passive sexual roles that went far beyond bedroom preferences. To be labeled aga or raga, terms meaning unmanly or effeminate, was not merely an insult, it was a legal death sentence. Consider this. Under Viking law, calling a man sexually passive was grounds for justifiable homicide. The accused could legally kill his accuser on the spot. Why such extreme reactions to sexual insults? Because in Norse society, sexual passivity meant the complete destruction of a man's legal existence. Passive men lost property rights, could not bear weapons, could not testify in court, and became social outcasts whose very presence contaminated other men. This system created a perpetual cycle of violence where men constantly needed to prove their dominance through increasingly brutal acts. The pressure was so intense that wives could, and did, publicly shame their husbands for sexual inadequacy, sometimes divorcing them and destroying their reputations in the process. This wasn't liberation. This was weaponized sexuality designed to maintain hierarchies through terror. The Viking approach to conquest reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their sexual political system. When Ibn Fadlan recorded his observations, he was documenting a culture that had weaponized rape and sexual humiliation as instruments of statecraft. The practice of klumhog, the shame stroke, involved stabbing defeated enemies in the buttocks to symbolically penetrate them. This wasn't random violence, it was psychological warfare designed to strip opponents of their masculine essence and, by extension, their right to rule. Captured kings faced public sexual assault, not as punishment, but as a transfer of power. The logic was simple and terrifying. To conquer a man sexually was to absorb his authority completely. Archaeological evidence supports the saga's accounts of systematic sexual violence during raids. Sites across Ireland and Britain show evidence of mass graves where women and children were killed after periods of captivity, suggesting organized systems of sexual exploitation that preceded execution. The psychological impact was so profound that entire communities would surrender rather than risk capture, demonstrating how sexual violence became an effective tool of territorial expansion. What modern audiences struggle to comprehend is the sheer scale of Viking involvement in sexual slavery. By the 10th century, up to 30% of Dublin's population consisted of enslaved people, many trafficked specifically for sexual purposes. This wasn't a peripheral activity, it was a cornerstone of the Viking economy. The legal distinction between free and enslaved women reveals the systematic nature of this exploitation. Free Viking women enjoyed remarkable legal protections. They could divorce husbands for sexual inadequacy, inherit property, operate businesses, and even propose marriage. These rights were among the most progressive in medieval Europe. However, these very protections highlighted the complete vulnerability of enslaved women, who were classified as livestock rather than humans. Raping a free woman carried the death penalty under Norse law, while sexually assaulting an enslaved woman resulted in fines equivalent to damaging someone's cattle. This dual system created a hierarchy of sexual violence that reinforced class divisions while providing legal frameworks for systematic abuse. Viking marriages were never private affairs. They were public performances designed to demonstrate power, fertility, and social control. The practice of witnessed consummation, where family members and sometimes priests remained present during the wedding night, transforms our understanding of medieval intimacy. Bed sheets were displayed as proof of virginity, while failure to perform sexually could result in lawsuits, divorce, or financial penalties. The religious symbolism embedded in wedding rituals reveals the explicit connection between sexuality and power. Placing Thor's hammer on the bride's lap wasn't subtle metaphor, it was a direct invocation of phallic power designed to ensure fertility and male dominance. These weren't romantic ceremonies, they were public declarations of ownership and reproductive control. The economic dimensions of marriage extended far beyond bride prices. Women's reproductive capacity was treated as valuable property, with complex legal frameworks governing adultery, divorce, and inheritance. The ability to produce legitimate heirs directly impacted family wealth and political succession, making women's sexuality a crucial element in maintaining power structures across generations. Ibn Fadlan's account of the funeral ritual he witnessed represents perhaps the most disturbing intersection of sexuality and death in recorded history. When a Viking chieftain died, a slave girl would volunteer to accompany him in death, but not before being passed among the men in ritual intercourse designed to transfer life force to the deceased. The Angel of Death, as Ibn Fadlan called her, would strangle and stab the girl before she was burned alive with the chief on his funeral ship. This wasn't isolated brutality. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Oseberg burial in Norway confirms that women were regularly killed alongside high-status men, validating the historical accuracy of these accounts. These rituals reveal how Viking society viewed sexuality as a form of spiritual currency that could be transferred between the living and the dead. The systematic nature of these practices suggests they weren't aberrations, but fundamental religious observances that reinforced both gender hierarchies and beliefs about the afterlife. One of the most complex aspects of Viking sexual culture was the paradoxical status of free women. While enslaved women faced systematic brutalization, free Viking women wielded power that was extraordinary for medieval Europe. They could initiate divorce proceedings, own property independently, and even participate in blood feuds. However, this agency came with dark responsibilities. Saga literature documents women encouraging male relatives to commit sexual violence, participating directly in warfare, and using sexual accusations as weapons in political conflicts. The system that granted them unusual freedoms also required them to participate in its cycles of violence and domination. This paradox reveals how Viking society used selective empowerment as a tool of social control. By granting certain women significant rights while completely dehumanizing others, the culture created internal divisions that prevented unified resistance to the broader system of sexual exploitation. Viking attitudes toward homosexuality illuminate the broader obsession with dominance that characterized Norse culture. Same-sex relations between men were legally and socially acceptable, provided the participants maintained proper roles. The active partner retained full social status, while the passive partner faced the same social death as men accused of being arger. Even the gods weren't immune to these sexual politics. Loki faced mockery for shape-shifting into female forms and giving birth, while Odin himself was accused of unmanliness for practicing Seder magic, which was associated with women. These mythological narratives reinforced social norms while revealing anxieties about gender fluidity and sexual role reversal. The legal treatment of sexual insults reveals their fundamental importance to Viking society. False accusations of sexual passivity were punishable as harshly as murder, demonstrating that reputation management was literally a matter of life and death. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way Viking society transformed sexual violence into public entertainment. Execution sites show evidence of ritualized sexual mutilation performed as public spectacle, while saga literature describes captured enemies being forced into degrading acts for Viking amusement. These weren't private acts of cruelty. They were community events designed to reinforce social hierarchies through collective participation in sexual violence. The public nature of these punishments created shared complicity that bound communities together through witnessed brutality. As Christianity gradually spread through Scandinavia, traditional Norse sexual practices faced increasing pressure to conform to new moral standards. However, the transition was neither immediate nor complete. Many Christian Vikings maintained traditional practices while adopting new religious identities, creating hybrid cultural forms that blended Norse sexual dominance with Christian marriage ideals. The influence of Viking sexual culture extended far beyond medieval Scandinavia. Their systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of conquest shaped political structures across Europe, while their concepts of honor and masculinity influenced cultural development for centuries. Understanding Viking sexual practices requires us to abandon romanticized notions of noble warriors and acknowledge the systematic nature of sexual violence in medieval Scandinavian society. This wasn't random brutality. It was a carefully constructed system that used sexuality as a weapon of war, a tool of legal authority, and a means of social control. The archaeological evidence, legal codes, and contemporary accounts all point to the same uncomfortable truth. Viking society operated on principles of sexual dominance so pervasive they shaped every aspect of daily life. From marriage contracts to funeral rites, from legal proceedings to military campaigns, sexuality was never separated from power, and power was never exercised without sexual dimensions. This knowledge challenges us to examine our own cultural assumptions about masculinity, violence, and power. The Viking legacy reminds us that societies can normalize practices that later generations find abhorrent, and that the intersection of sexuality and politics remains a dangerous force in human civilization. Next week, we will explore how these Viking practices influenced the development of medieval European legal systems and continue to shape modern concepts of masculinity and honor.